Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Bartholomew Bland. I'm the Executive Director of the Lehman College Art Gallery. And I'm very pleased that you could join us all today for what is the fourth in our series of 6 speakers this spring, all of whom are grappling with issues of design and how it affects our contemporary society. The speaker series is generously funded by the Sara Little Turnbull Foundation and is part of the design initiative of Sara Little Turnbull. Here at Lehman College is a pilot program that blends robust academics with engaging public programs. This is a joint collaboration of Lehman College's art department and the art gallery, and it's a fruition of Lehman's long commitment to the arts across multiple fields, and it's a unique opportunity to expand the reach of design, which, as we all know, is essential to every member of society, and to not keep it to the students just majoring in art, but to bring it across the disciplines at the college. So we're very excited to be able to present this. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Khawar, who is a wonderful and accomplished person in the field of design. Feryal is a Pakistani native who studied math, physics, and artificial intelligence learning. Khawar first worked at the Vancouver Information Security Company after earning a degree in computer systems engineering. However, as she has said, she gradually lost interest in that work and wanted to take a different path, and discovered a passion for digital design when she went to study at the Vancouver Film School, where she also learned film design. She then joined Amazon Fresh in Seattle, where she is now a senior user experience designer for Amazon. And during her 8 years at Amazon, she has designed many aspects of the grocery shopping experience on Amazon Fresh. She has built an information and visual design system for product results within Amazon Search, and it's currently at Kindle, reimagining the way readers consume content on their Kindle apps. Outside of work, she's an avid baker and reader. And I have to say, on top of everything else, if you have not seen the poster for the Turnbull series, Feryal has probably the best pick to be used as a head and shoulders shot that I have yet seen. You very much inspired me to go out and design a better one for myself. You can check out Feryal's pick and all of our programs at lehmangallery.org. We're lucky today that Feryal will be speaking with us on the topic vital to every business in the contemporary world, with a talk entitled Design Thinking, Solutions Based on Empathy and Customer Obsession. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Laura Silva, who has a few remarks. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Bart, for that introduction. Today is a very, very happy day for me, not only because it's a class day and Thursdays are very special to me because I'm excited to see my students, but because Feryal is the first mentor that I ever had in design. She is the first person that showed me the ropes when I worked at Amazon, doing my internship and fresh out of college. And so inviting her, I knew that it was one of those decisions that was going to touch the students as much as it touched me because she's just that amazing. And yeah, her pastries, unbelievable, guys, unbelievable. But she's going, our class in design for immigration has to deal with understanding all aspects of immigration, including the people that make the law and the people that use the laws and interact with them and the people that live in this environment. And so I didn't knew someone better to extrapolate and explain these complex ideas or explain a way for us to understand these complex ideas more than Feryal. So I am super, super excited. I welcome you guys. And without further ado, Feryal, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for those very kind words. I really appreciate it. And I really miss Laura because she brought so much color and passion to our team. So it's been a few years now and I still miss her. I still miss her. Well, to begin, I'm gonna figure out first to make sure that our technology is set up. So Let me see if I can share my screen. Post disabled participant. All right. You might have to enable me to screen share.
You should be able to have an out on your screen.
It basically says
you're all set now.
I think. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Yep.
sorry about that. My fault.
No worries. So let's see which one does it share. All right, apologies for this, guys. I knew we might have some issues. Will not be able to record content. Later. All right, let's see if this works. Can you guys see my screen? You can't see my screen yet. All right, so all panelists, who can start sharing when someone else is sharing? Only host. Okay. This is still not working. All right, so I finally have that. Okay. Let's see. Share.
There we go.
Excellent. Okay.
Let's
and I want to see. Great. So which screen? I hope you're seeing the presenter screen, right?
We are seeing the main screen, applying the lens of customer subject to systems. We got you.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's presenter view. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. So let's kick it off. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Let me start by saying that the subject of my conversation today is one that I myself am still a student of. However, it is a subject that I do very firmly believe needs to be studied by many more of us if we are to tackle the problems that we are facing today. But before I get to the subject of my talk, I do want to take you on a brief journey of how I myself came to this subject. All right, move ahead. Apologies, folks. There's something going on. Okay. All right. So I started out studying to become an engineer. As Bart mentioned, I grew up in Pakistan and there weren't that many choices around for what to do for one's undergrad. I was a math and a physics nerd and I figured engineering was as good a choice as any. And while I don't remember exactly the specifics of the topics we studied, what I did take away from those 4 years was an engineer's approach to solving a problem, which is way more about diving deep into a problem space, breaking it down into smaller, more understandable pieces, and then combining solutions to those smaller pieces into some sort of a whole. So in a nutshell, engineering school taught me to identify solutions in terms of what was technically possible and to identify the technical constraints to those solutions. After I graduated from my undergrad, I very serendipitously found a school in Canada called Vancouver Film School that taught something called user experience design. And here at Vancouver Film School, I learned another approach to solving problems, one that is based on a central tenet that products and services that we create are not complete without the people who use them. So like it or not, people, irritable, demanding, and often distracted people like ourselves, and their goals are the point of our solutions and services. And we must therefore design for them. And so we must begin any kind of problem-solving task first by examining the needs, the behaviors, the dreams of the people that we are trying to affect through our solutions and our work. After I graduated from design school, I got hired by this little small company called Amazon. And here I learned another lesson in solutioning, which is that in the real world, the best solution is the one that gets out the door the fastest. So the unattainable best is really, truly the enemy of all the attainable betters. And it turns out that my education and my life experiences through, honestly, very little deliberate design of my own really taught me what is now popularly called a human-centric design approach. And this very successful framework has been used to produce many of the products that we all use and love today. And I'd like to share with you a very brief story about one of my personal favorites that came out of this approach. And it's funny enough, it's a kitchen tool, it's the Oxo Peeler. So take a look at this.
We work as consultants, which means we work with a lot of different companies in a lot of different fields. But really our common interest is in understanding people and what their needs are. So if you start to think, well, really what these guys do as consultants is focus on people, then it's easy to think about what's needed design-wise in the kitchen or in the hospital or in the car. We have clients come to us and say, here's our average customer. For instance, female, she's 34 years old, she has 2.3 kids. And we listen politely and say, well, that's great, but we don't care about that person. What we really need to do to design is look at the extremes. The weakest or the person with arthritis or the athlete or the strongest or the fastest person. Because if we understand what the extremes are, the middle will take care of itself. It's actually things I haven't seen in 1,000 years.
I try to use less material, like there's one that's hollow inside. A good friend of mine, Sam Barber, he was vacationing with his wife, Betsy. I got a phone call one night. He was so excited. He said he couldn't sleep. And what he was excited about is he had been cooking dinner with Betsy, and she was making an apple tart. And she was complaining about the peeler, that it was hurting her hands. And she had arthritis, and she just couldn't hang on to it. And it hit Sam at that moment that here's a product that nobody's really thought about.
And our thought was, well, if we can make it work for people with arthritis, it could be good for everybody.
We knew that it had to be a bigger handle. Kids have big crayons because they're easier to hold on to. It's the same thing for somebody that might not have full mobility of their hand. They need something a little bit larger that's a little easier to grip with a little bit less force. So we did a lot of studies around the shape of the handle, the size of it, to come up with that size that would be perfect for everybody.
But eventually we found a rubberized bicycle grip, and we basically did this. So it really goes through many, many more iterations than you would think to do a handle that's relatively simple in the end.
So you can see some of the reasons why this approach was so widely embraced. In fact, it's been embraced first by all of the Silicon Valley, and now beyond even that. And it clearly produces results that are good, that are designed well. But take a look at another example.
When you go to Google and type in climate change is, you're going to see different results depending on where you live and the particular things that Google knows about your interests. That's not by accident, that's a design technique. What I want people to know is that everything they're doing online is being watched, is being tracked. Every single action you take is carefully monitored and recorded. A lot of people think Google's just a search box and Facebook's just a place to see what my friends are doing. What they don't realize is there's entire teams of engineers whose job is to use your psychology against you. I was the co-inventor of the Facebook like button. I was the president of Pinterest, Google, Twitter,
Instagram.
There were meaningful changes happening around the world because of these platforms. I think we were naive about the flip side of that coin.
You get rewarded by hearts, likes, thumbs up, and we conflate that with value and we conflate it with truth.
A whole generation is more anxious, more depressed.
I always felt like fundamentally it was a force for good. I don't know if I feel that way anymore.
Facebook discovered that they were...
All right. So what's going on? Clearly, all these companies, they have plenty of smart people, many of whom are using the principles of human-centered designs to create very effective products. but the collective impact seems to be something that is quite negative. And while part of it is because some of these people are using tools that human-centered design gives us very much for their own benefit. And in some ways, the system is operating exactly how it is designed. But beyond just deliberate maliciousness, I do think there is also a great deal of ignorance. The problem with human-centered design is that even when it is being used benevolently, it is highly reductionist in its approach, in that it solves customer problems in a customer-centric way within very confined boundaries of time, money, and life. And while that focused lens is definitely great and it can definitely produce some amazing results, what we seem to have forgotten is that life really doesn't happen in isolated moments. Life is very much connected, moments impact one another. And while we can't solve for all of life all the time, we have to at least acknowledge that our products and services do have a collective impact beyond the time for which we design it for, and we have to take responsibility for those consequences. And that is where, and that is how, that is what brings me to system design. System design really takes all those kind of customer obsessions that we have about trying to understand the customers, about what motivates them, why they behave the way they do, but it attempts to apply that lens to a much broader perspective and to a much longer frame of time than we typically consider for product design. And it is a massive subject. And today I'm only going to be able to give you a very brief introduction to the topic, mostly in the hopes that it reminds you to keep asking broader questions as you look to solving problems. So what we're going to be covering today is some very basic definitions of what exactly a system is, how we can model their structures and behaviors, and then we're going to talk through some real world examples that really show what happens when people try to influence systems. And I will warn that as you get deeper into the study of systems, it may not happen today, but definitely if you pursue this and you get deeper into the study of systems, you will realize that for all their complexity, system design is weirdly similar to common sense. And the reason for that is that long before rational reductionist analysis became the basis of modern education, we all used to deal with complex systems. We are complex systems. And so we have built up intuitively, without analysis, quite a good practical understanding of how systems work and how we can work with them. The problem is we seem to have forgotten a lot of that collective wisdom that we had inherited. So studying systems is quite a bit like going back to ancient wisdom. I'm referencing in today's talk, a lot of the content is from this wonderful, wonderful book, which I highly recommend, called Thinking in Systems, from Donella H. Meadows. So I highly recommend that you go and seek it out and read up on it afterwards, as we're only going to be covering a very small part of this, this vast, vast topic. All right, so let's get into it and get some basic definitions out of the way. So what is a system? A system is it is an interconnected set of elements that are coherently organized to achieve a function or a purpose. And if you look at that definition very carefully for a minute, you will see that a system must consist of three kinds of things. It must have elements, it must have interconnections, and it must have a function. So if you look at a very obvious system, like the digestive system, you'll see that the elements of the system are things like the mouth, the teeth, the enzymes, the stomach, the intestines. These are all interconnected through the physical flow of food and through an elegant set of chemicals that regulate the system. And the function of the system is to break down the food that we eat into its most basic nutrients, to pass on those nutrients into the bloodstream, which itself is a system, and to discard any unusable waste. But beyond something that may be something super obvious, consider this. A football team is also a system, and it has elements such as players, the coach, the field, the ball. Its interconnections are the rules of the game. the coach's strategy, the player's communication, and the laws of physics that basically govern the motion of the ball and the players. And the purpose of the team is to win games, it's to have fun, to have exercise, or to make money, or all of the above. An animal is a system. A tree is a system. A forest is an even larger system that's made up of animals and trees. And so what we see through all these examples is that systems tend to have a wholeness to them. They have a wholeness and they have an integrity to them, and they have an active set of mechanisms that try to maintain it. So when a living creature dies, it does tend to lose some of its systemness, in that all its multiple interrelations that held it together no longer function, and basically the living creature breaks down into its constituent chemicals, which nonetheless become part of this larger food system. Another very powerful thing about systems is that systems can exhibit adaptive, dynamic, goal-seeking, self-preserving, and even evolutionary behaviors. And this allows new systems to arise from old systems. And it is these properties which make them so powerful. Now, the elements of a system are often the easiest parts of the system to notice, mostly because they are often visible, tangible things. So consider a university. In the system called university, you have elements like buildings, students, professors, computers, books, administrators, etc. Elements don't have to just be physical things. Intangibles can also be part of a system. For example, you can have academic prowess or school pride, which is a very key part of a system. The main thing is, once you start listing the elements, it's almost like an endless process. So before you go down that road, it's better to just stop dissecting the elements and to start looking towards the interconnections or the relationships between the elements. So in the university system, these relationships can include things like standards of admission, which determine who gets in and who doesn't. Requirements for degrees, exams, grades, gossip, which is the main information flow system, and most importantly, the communication of knowledge. And these elements and interconnections come together for the supposed purpose of discovering, preserving, and passing on knowledge to new generations. And I say supposed here, not because I doubt universities' aspirations at all, but because it is always a good idea to deduce the function of a system through its behaviors and not just through its stated goals and words. For example, Apple may choose to describe that the purpose of their Apple Pay service is to provide safe, cashless, and effortless mechanism to pay for purchases. And while that is strictly not untrue, I would counter, based on the behaviors that we see, that convenience and security is not the ultimate purpose of these kind of financial tools and systems. These kind of tools and systems create more and more layers of abstraction from actual money, and they make it easier and easier for us to think less and less of how, when, and where we spend money. And as a result of this, we now have a behavior of potentially inconsiderate spending, which is resulting in the average American household carrying a credit card debt of almost $16,000. So I would say that the ultimate purpose of these financial tools is to get people to spend more and more money so we can keep our consumption-based economy going. And that's what I mean by saying that it's very important to look past the rhetoric to deduce the purpose of a system. They may align, which is great, but it's not always true. What makes it even more complicated is that systems can be nested within one another, and that means that purposes can be nested within one another. Consider the university again. So the university has an uber goal of discovering, preserving, disseminating knowledge. And within the university, the purpose of a student may be to get a good grade. The purpose of a professor may be to get tenure. The purpose of an administrator may be to balance a budget. And any of these sub-purposes could come into conflict with the overall purpose of the university. So the student may cheat to get a good grade. The professor may ignore the students to publish more papers to get tenure. And the administrator may fire the professors to balance the budget. So keeping all our sub-purposes and overall system in harmony is one of the key aspects of a successful system, as we will see in later examples. One other thing to keep in mind is that nearly every system has at least one function, which is to ensure that it itself survives and perpetuates. Changing elements of a system usually has the least effect of the system. So in a university, you have a constant flow of students coming and going. You have a slightly slower flow of professors and administrators. But despite this turnover, the university is still a university. With every new batch, there are subtle differences, but it is effectively the same university, even when the elements turn over. Changing interconnections or relationships between the elements, though, can change it dramatically, even if the elements remain the same. So consider this: if in a university, we created a new rule that said all arguments have to be won by force instead of by reason, then it's very likely not going to be a university anymore, and it's going to be something more like the Hunger Games. So even with the same players, by changing the rules, you end up with a completely different system. Changing the function or purpose of a system has a profound effect on the whole, even if the elements or interconnections remain the same. So consider a football team. You can have the same players, the same set of rules, but let's suppose you change the function to losing instead of winning, and it's a completely different ballgame. So far what we've learned is that systems are interconnected elements. They're organized to achieve a purpose. And to now start to understand how systems behave, we have to start looking a little bit into the structure of the systems themselves and into the mechanisms that produce the behaviors within the systems. And again, the point of all this exercise is that the more that you can understand systems and their behaviors, the more you can then try to influence them. Now, a stock is the foundation of every system. And a stock is what it sounds like. It's a quantity, it's an accumulation of material or information, something that gets built up over time. And it can be literally anything that can be counted, right? So it can be water in a bathtub. It can be the population of a country. It can be the book in the bookstores. It can be the money in your account. It can be your own self-confidence, right? So you're constantly measuring, how's my self-confidence doing? Is it high? Is it low? Is it kind of like at equilibrium? And stocks change over time through the action of a flow. So flows can be things like filling and draining. So in the case of the bathtub, you have a flow that causes the water in the bathtub to increase. That's through the tap. You have a flow that causes the water in the bathtub to decrease, which is through the drain. In a population, you can have inflows and outflows, which are births and deaths, which affect the amount of people in a population. For money in your account, you have deposits and withdrawals, which affect the levels of the stock in your bank account. And so you can think of stocks as almost like being the memory of the history of changing flows within a system, right? So if you go and read your bank statement, it'll craft a picture of what happened to the money coming in, or it'll tell a story of how the money came in and how the money went out. And the last part of the structure of a system is something called feedback loops. And these are mechanisms that basically help regulate the level of the stocks by manipulating the flows. And putting it all together, let's take a look at a very simple example of the system. So consider a bathtub, right? So we have a bathtub, there's water in the bathtub is our stock. We have an inflow, so there is a tap that adds water in, and we have a drain that drains water out, right? So let's look at how this system could behave over time. So imagine you start with the empty bathtub, you plug in the drain, and you turn on the tap. What happens? Water starts coming in, your bathtub starts to fill up, and if you don't do anything, it keeps filling and filling and filling till it reaches the top, and then the water starts to overflow. So at that point in time, you have water coming in, but all of it is going out. So the level of water in your bathtub becomes static. It's what we call dynamic equilibrium. It achieves dynamic equilibrium, and that there's no increase, there's no decrease, it's just staying at the same level. So now you pull out the drain. And so what starts to happen? Water starts to drain out, the level of the water in the bathtub starts to decrease. At some point, it may happen that the rate of draining equals the equals the rate at which the water is being added. So it may hit momentarily a new dynamic equilibrium at which the water level doesn't change. At that point, you turn off the tap, and now what do you have? You have a bathtub full of water that's just draining, and so your bathtub eventually just empties out. So congratulations, you walked through your very first system. And by understanding some of the dynamics that were happening, some of the behavior that was happening between the stock, the amount that you were trying to control, and the inflows and outflows, it basically tells you how to understand complex systems. And to reiterate some of the lessons we learned through the bathtub example, what we see is that as long as your inflows are greater than your outflows, your stock level will increase. So think about it as money. As long as you are making more money than you're spending, your bank account keeps increasing. As long as your outflows are greater than your inflows, your stock levels fall. So if you're spending more money than you're making, then your bank account is going to shrink. And if your inflows and your outflows are the same, then your system is in dynamic equilibrium, which means it doesn't increase or decrease, it just stays the same. Humans tend to focus a lot more on stocks than they do on the mechanisms that increase and decrease it, that is the flows. And even within the flows, we as human beings tend to have a bias to look more on inflows than we do on outflows. And what that means is that sometimes we can miss out on the fact that you can fill up a bathtub, not just by increasing the amount of water or the rate of water that you're putting in, but you can also fill up a bathtub by decreasing the amount of draining that's happening, right? So if it was your bank account, for example, you can save more money, not just by making more money, but also by spending less money. So that's an important thing to remember, that there are levers on both sides that you can use. Another key aspect of systems, and particularly stocks, and this is really important, is that stocks take time to change because flows take time to flow, right? And because of this, stocks act as delays and buffers in the system. And this can both be a problem and it can be a source of stability. For example, a new president can't change things overnight. It takes time to create jobs, to train people. Even if you have all the money in the world, you still have that time delay. You can't clean up air and water overnight when you've taken decades to pollute it. But on the flip side, you also can't destroy something like, for example, you can't erode soil all at once. It takes time. And you can pump up groundwater from the ground a lot faster than the rate at which the aquifer can recharge for many, many years before you deplete it to the point where it's destroyed. The main thing with this is that because stocks take time to change and they take time to adjust, stocks are the part of the system that set the dynamics of the system. They set the limits for how quickly you can change the system. And by imposing these kind of time lags, they can actually give you room to maneuver, to experiment, to revise policies that aren't working, because you can see that, oh, this seems to be trending this way, we might want to change our mind. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit more about the feedback mechanisms, which basically influence the flows that then influence the level of the stock. Feedback loops cause stocks to either maintain their level within a range, to grow or decline. We have two kinds of feedback loops in systems. We have balancing feedback loops, which try to pull the stock to maintain a stock within a given range of values. And these are called goal-seeking or stability-seeking feedback loops. And the main thing about balancing loops is that they tend to oppose the direction that you try to implement on the system. And those words aside, it's as simple as that. If you try to increase the stock, a balancing loop will try to decrease it. If you try to decrease the stock, a balancing loop will try to increase it. So it basically tries to maintain the system around some kind of a range of values. The second type of loop that we have is called a reinforcing loop. And these are called colloquially runaway loops because they amplify, they enhance whatever direction of change you impose on it. So the simplest way to think of it is more rabbits will lead to more rabbits, right? So the more rabbits there are, the more rabbit parents there are to make more rabbit babies. The more baby rabbits there are, the more they grow up to become rabbit parents. And so there are even more rabbit babies. So it becomes like a vicious cycle, depending on whether or not you like rabbits. And the flip side of it is the more I practice the piano, the more pleasure I get from the sound. And so the more I play the piano, and therefore the more I practice. So this creates a virtual cycle. The key thing to remember with reinforcing loops is they can be found wherever you have a system, wherever you have an element in the system that has the ability to reproduce itself or grow as a constant of itself. And the simplest way to think about this would be something like interest-based earnings, right? So the more money you have in your account, the more money you make from interest, which adds more money to your account, which then continues the cycle. So the thing about runaway loops is that they enhance the direction of the change you apply, but they tend to do it exponentially. It's not a linear, slow change. It can grow very rapidly from a very small amount to a very large amount. So you have to be careful about runaway loops in your system. So the point of all this spiel was, and I know it can sound very esoteric, is we want to understand what systems are. They're interconnected elements organized to achieve a purpose. They have a structure which can be thought of as connected stocks, which are these amounts that you're tracking, with feedback mechanisms that are regulating these amounts through things called flows. And the feedback mechanisms that you have in the system can create various kinds of behaviors. So if you just understand this basic part of it, there's a lot more to it. I'm going to stop with the basics here. We can walk through a couple of examples to really see how this gets applied. Like, why is all of this important? This kind of breakdown into elements, functions, and interconnections and stocks and whatnot. So let's look at a very common system. So this is a system which has one stock called population, and it has a reinforcing loop and a balancing loop. And this system, for all its simplicity, all system models are kind of a simplification of the real world. But this system is basically the system that represents all populations and economies in the world. And for all its simplicity, it's quite enough to walk through some of the examples that we're going to look at. So there are a couple of things once we have that, just to clarify what we're looking at. A population is a system. So you have a stock of population. It has a reinforcing loop. And what it means is the stock increases through births and it decreases through deaths, right? So it has deaths are balancing out the population by reducing it, and births are increasing the population by adding more people to the population. There are a couple of things we can deduce about the behavior of this system, right? So we can deduce that if the system has more births than deaths, right? So the reinforcing loop has a dominant aspect on the system, then you end up with a population that is increasing, right? The other thing we can deduce is if our balancing loop becomes more dominant, that is, there are more deaths than there are births, then you have a population that is declining over time. And if they're the same, then they'll be in dynamic equilibrium. Countries and governments care a lot about balancing population stocks because of how intrinsically they're all tied to the economy, to politics, to culture. And however, how you manage this particular stock can have hugely different consequences. So consider Romania in 1967. So Romania had the problem, it had an issue of declining population in 1967. They were worried that as their population declined, they would have fewer people to work in the workforce. And as a result of it, it would lead to economic decline. And they decided to correct this situation. They saw this structure and they're like, great, we need to figure out a way to add more people to increase our reinforcing loop and reduce the impact of our balancing loop, which is the number of deaths. So they decided to do that by making abortions and contraceptives illegal to women under the age of 45, right? So they're trying to reduce access to contraceptives, which they're hoping would increase the number of births, and they're trying to reduce access to abortions, which they're hoping are going to increase the number of deaths. And therefore, the net result that they're trying to achieve is we will have a greater population. So what ended up happening is shortly after they implemented this policy, the birth rate tripled, right? But something truly horrifying started to happen after that. Although contraceptives and abortions remained illegal, the birth rate slowly started to come back to its original level. And this was achieved by Romanians basically dealing with very dangerous abortion practices, which resulted in not only the birth rate coming down, but tripling the maternity mortality rate. In fact, many of the children who were born who had not been wanted were abandoned to orphanages. And so by they senselessly trying to influence the behavior of the system and saying, okay, we need to increase the number of people, so let's figure out a way by which we can have more births, the government just failed to take into account that Romanians had a low birth rate, not because they didn't want to have more kids, but because they were too poor to raise them. And by forcing this overarching goal on the system, which is we want to increase the number of Romanians, without aligning any of the goals of the people within the system, resulted in a behavior called policy resistance. So what happens, as we mentioned before, that the key aspect of a successful system is that all your subsystems have goals that harmonize and line up, right? It's a key part of managing systems. But the Romanian government totally ignored the purposes of all the subsystems within their system and ended up with a policy that nobody wanted, that didn't align with any of their goals. And as a result, it resulted in heartache. And instead of taking this opportunity to saying, okay, you know what, we should actually back off, we should reconsider our policies, they made the double mistake of powering down on it. And what ended up happening with that is that not only did it cause an increase in maternal mortality rates, no significant increase in birth rates, but it effectively just caused an increase in resentment against the government, to the point that when the government was overthrown, the first thing that the new government did was execute the guy who had created this abortion policy. So the thing to remember here is that if these systematic structures can give you a very brief overview of what you're dealing with, but if you don't apply some of the customer obsession about like, what are the whys behind these behaviors, you could end up with really, really bad consequences. On the flip side of it, Hungary, which is one of the neighbors of the Romanians, when they had a very similar problem, they were also facing a declining population. And instead of trying to force a policy onto the public, they did try to attempt to understand, well, why is it that the Hungarians, for example, didn't want to have more kids? And what they found out was that the Hungarians just didn't want to have more kids because they had very cramped living situation. And so what they did was they said in an attempt to increase their population, they said, okay, we're going to incentivize people to have larger families by giving them bigger living spaces. Now, while that policy was also only partially successful, it did attempt to somewhat understand what the goals of all the people within the system were and to somewhat align to those goals. So it definitely did better than Romania, but only partially, because there were more things which contributed to why the Hungarians, for example, didn't want to have as many kids. The last example of this is Sweden. Sweden also in the 1930s, they had a precipitous decline in their population, their birth rates. And like the Hungarians and the Romanians, they were worried what it would mean in terms of economics. And however, they did the smart thing. They were like, okay, let's assess the goals of the government, which is we want to increase the population. Again, I know it sounds weird, like why is the government trying to increase the population? And I can understand that there might actually be a benefit to it. They were like, we need to increase the population so our economy doesn't go down. And because if the economy goes down, it's going to affect our population. So they were trying to do a good thing, but trying to do it in not so very customer-centric ways. So the Swedish government, they're like, okay, let's assess our goals and let's assess the goals of the population. And they decided that there was a basis of agreement, not on the size of the family. They couldn't figure out a way by which they could get all the Swedes to agree to one optimum size of the family, but they could get all the Swedes to agree on the quality of childcare. So they're like, all the Swedes believe every child born should be wanted and nurtured. No child should be in material need. Every child should have access to healthcare and excellent education. So these were the goals that both the government and its people could align to. And the resulting policy that they implemented did look strange at a time when there was a very low birth rate, because they said, okay, we're going to give free access to contraceptives, to abortion. We're going to have widespread sex ed. We're going to make divorce laws easier. We're going to provide support for families in need. We're going to increase investment in health and education. And what ended up happening was that since then, Sweden's birth rate has gone up and down a little bit, several times, but it did not cause a panic, because the nation as a whole was focused on far more important things than just the number of Swedes. So the point of these examples is that the more that we can understand how the complexities of these systems and the behaviors that they create and the whys behind the behaviors, the more we can the more we can apply the right levers to influence it in a way that gets all of us what we want. So the Swedish government clearly wanted to basically enable a stronger economy, but they just recognized that just looking at population may not be the only mechanism to do it. And so they implemented a policy that had much more harmonious results than the Hungarians and the Romanians. A similar example that we find is in China. So China had they had the opposite example in 1979, where they were trying to control their population growth. And they implemented the one-child policy to do so. And I won't go into too much details about it, but it was abandoned in 2015. And what they ended up doing was this also had some very unintended consequences, right? So they were able to bring their population under control, but at a huge cost. In China, there were some local sentiment for like people preferred boys over girls. So a lot of girls ended up getting abandoned or aborted. Over time, the Chinese population's demographic has shifted really hard towards a very high male to female ratio, which is now causing issues of loneliness. There are just not enough women in China for all the men. So the key thing is that these kind of decisions that people make, they have really far-reaching consequences. And if you're not thinking through some of these far-reaching consequences, you can end up creating far more problems than you've actually solved. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to, because there's a lot more to it. And I just hope that this very brief insight into systems and applying whys and hows to a much broader perspective is going to make you curious, all of you curious enough to learn more about it. And if nothing else, at least it'll make you ask more questions around the boundaries that you are being asked to work with it. So thank you so much for listening.
I mean, I'm just doing this, guys. I don't know how you guys were, but I'm just like this. I'm writing notes, as I taught my students that that's the best way to learn is to write notes. But I'm paying. This was fantastic. Feryal, thank you so much for this. As always, I can just listen to you all day long. I have had the pleasure to listen to her all day long, and it's unbelievable. I love it. And we actually have really interesting questions in the Q&A that we have time. I want to ask Professor Galvez if you have some specific questions that you want to go ahead before I go to the Q&A section.
I have so many questions, but I'm going to cede my privilege to the students because they really came up with some great questions.
Okay, all right. Let me then go ahead and look at the list of questions that we have for you, Feryal. Once again, thank you. I'm just so happy right now, guys. It's just, oh. So we have a very interesting question that ties to almost the end of your presentation.
Okay.
My student is asking if attempting to influence a system and something that is orchestrated and organized a certain way will cause there to be an unpredicted and possible dangerous outcome. And furthermore, how can we then try to not get, ahead of ourselves and implode when we're trying to change the system?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to quote the wonderful writer whose work I was referencing here, who says throughout the book that despite she taught this at MIT, I believe she was at MIT last, she taught the subject for 30 years. And she did mention that systems, despite her teaching them for 30 or more years, they constantly surprised her. Because you're right, they are so complex that it's not always possible to know how changing one thing will change another. I will say though, is once you start studying the subject in more depth, you do learn of some of the more common kind of archetypes or system traps to avoid. So I literally only covered one, which was like policy resistance, which is what happens when you have sub-purposes which are in conflict with one another. There are many, many more along those lines. So the more you study them, the more you become familiar with them, the more you can start to anticipate, okay, these are some of the issues, these are some of the traps I don't want to get into. The other big part of systems that we really didn't go into is all the leverage points. That's also the way that Danella puts it, it's a growing list. And so systems can allow you to ask different what if questions about, what if I leverage this point? What if I leverage that point? And some of it is you're kind of modeling and predicting what would happen, and you do test and learn. And as I was saying, because stocks can give you a little bit of room to maneuver, sometimes it's okay to test a certain thing, see what happens, and then pull it back, adjust it. So that's where HCD can come in, where you're like, yeah, we're doing this iterative approach to testing and learning. So yeah, there's no 100% guarantee when you're dealing with such massive systems, what all the consequences will be. But honestly, the most important thing is to at least consider it, because I do feel in a lot of product design that we're doing today, we've kind of forgotten that things have consequences.
And so for that, tying to that, one of my students also asked, how those system designs,
sorry, that's something else.
How does system design then looks into the future? How do we create the muscle of thinking ahead so that we understand that the decisions we're making today are going to affect us in the long run? Is it beyond A/B testing or beyond what you just explained? Is there a way that we could think ahead?
It is a bit of an exercise, right? So for example, let me think through. So climate change, for example, is one that I think of a lot, right? So it's one of the things that as I was listening to Bill Gates, for example, about his new book, one of the things he was talking about is that some of the things that we use today, which are now becoming really hard to change, like concrete, which is the foundation of all our construction industry, right? For the longest time, concrete just didn't take into account the cost of the damage it does to the earth. So this product has been widely adopted because it was never priced for its full price, which takes into account that, sure, this is what it took you to produce it. This is the cost that you have to pay for the damage you caused to Earth. So it was just very cheaply available. So nobody ever really accounted for the full cost of it, right? So he talks a little bit about trying to kind of understand, like, when you start moving from concrete to other mechanisms, so to other kind of construction materials, like I think in Thailand, they were looking at bamboo. You do have to kind of ask yourself this question, is the solution just to move all of concrete to bamboo? Because then aren't you just using up bamboo a lot, like you suddenly have so much consumption of bamboo, you might be destroying the bamboo ecosystem. Well, the answer might be that bamboo maybe just regenerates a lot faster than concrete. The kind of damage that concrete maybe does to the earth is not something that the earth can heal fast enough at a fast enough rate for it to recover, because all systems do have to a certain level an ability to heal themselves. But if you're doing damage at a faster rate than it can heal itself, then yes, then you're in trouble. So some answer might be that, let's figure out like how we can play with the percentages. So the people who have relatively easier access to concrete, they can still use concrete for these things. And maybe we limit the kind of things that you use concrete for. People who have access to bamboo, maybe they use bamboo, and we limit the amount that you use bamboo for. So you're not going completely overboard one way or the other. So it is a little bit of a balancing act where you are asking yourself, if we go from this policy to this policy, what are some of the consequences that we can anticipate? So again, it's a little bit of a modeling exercise that you're doing in your head, that if you do A, does B also happen? And if B happens, does it influence A? So yeah, that's the best way that I can think of. And just like, there's a little bit of hypothetical. I'm sure they have a lot more where they are looking at these problems. They're using algorithms and models to actually come up with better predictions about what are the possible outcomes.
Well, in our class, this immigration design, we're asking our students to think of our current immigration system and think about how changing policies or specific of different policies will affect the overall experience, not only of those that work in the system, but those that benefit of the system itself. So I think it's a really great point that you said. This is a muscle, right? This is something that you have to constantly train yourself to think to how to think ahead, because this is what we're teaching our students is think of what we have today and let's think ahead of how things would look in the future if we were implement different changes in the system. So it's a great example, guys.
That resonated for me as well, because when you said, Feryal, that you have to deduce the function of a system from the behavior, not from its stated goals or principles. And that really rang true for me in our conversations about the migration system, because there are these lofty, kind of principles that, maybe are on the Statue of Liberty that, are supposed to inform, or the Constitution that are supposed to inform our system. But does our system on a day-to-day basis do anything that reflects those principles? No, rarely. And so, really thinking, having a cold look at what the outcomes and the real world effects of policies are, I think is such a great way to begin to think about how it can be improved.
The other thing that I've also learned the more that I've studied the subject is you do have to take a very kind of objective look into what you're trying to achieve, in the sense that functions predominantly are driven by paradigms, and paradigms are one of the hardest things to change. Even in the population example, what Sweden, for example, was able to do, they recognized that they just couldn't get everyone to agree to what an optimum family size is. That's a paradigm that it's driven by lots of different personal beliefs and desires and goals and whatnot. They just couldn't get everyone to agree to that. So they chose to kind of concentrate on a completely different goal where they could have much more popular agreement. And the more that I know very little about immigration design, I thought about maybe I should study up on it to understand a little bit more about it. But the more that I think about these kind of things, just from what I hear on the news, it really is about trying to understand, well, what are the paradigms that are really creating the outlooks people have towards immigration? Because my guess is most people actually have no clue what immigration means, how it impacts them, both positively and negatively. And so paradigms are really the key to changing purposes which really do change, which have the most impact on how systems behave.
Thank you.
Do we have time for another question?
We are technically over time, but it's up to you.
It's up to Feryal, actually.
Well, I have a few more minutes if you want, if there's another question.
Okay, I think the last question to close it from the list. I'm just gonna go through the list. This is a very interesting question that I think it goes back to maybe the relationship that you and I have and the idea of sharing this concept. How early should designers or students learn to understand the concepts of systems? The question is specifically on do we recommend teachers in high school to teach this, but I would rather you expand it and say, when do you think that people should get an idea of what systems are and how that process works?
Honestly, the answer to that is a little bit because, like I said, systems honestly are common. A lot of system thinking is common sense. And so it really is about starting very early to ask people to think critically and to think critically in terms of consequences. I had this, there was this really, let me see if I can find that quote. It was just really great how they were translating common jargon into a system language. Oh yeah, here it is. So this one is actually my favorite thing. So the language that a system uses. So I'm fully not expecting anyone to understand it. So this is what the system says. It says, according to the competitive exclusion principle, if a reinforcing feedback loop rewards the winner of a competition with the means to win further competitions, the result will be the elimination of all but a few competitors. Now, if you didn't get any of that, that's totally fine. But let me tell you what the ancient wisdom says. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's what that system principle said, is that if you set up competition so only the winners can keep winning more and the losers effectively keep losing more, you'll only end up with a few winners. So to answer that question, I would say that we used to be taught a lot earlier to think in much more complex situations than we are taught today. And it's not just about system thinking. It really is an approach to understand that life is a whole. Life is holistic. You do one thing, it affects another thing. And that, I would say, start teaching your kids the minute they're born. That, you do one thing, it's going to have consequences. And these things are all connected. So yeah, for as far as I'm concerned, it's never too early to start. And I can speak for myself in that the more you think about it, the better you get at understanding and seeing these patterns. But you have to be aware of them to start seeing some of them.
I love that you said that, because one of the themes in our class is we're telling our students that they have been dealing with ideas in design, right, since a very early age, without really knowing the specifics, right, without really knowing that they were designing or that they were being designers. They've been interacting with these ideas, and I think our class and the school is particularly interesting in that, because these are first generation or immigrants themselves, or these are men and women of color, minorities, that have to deal with a different set of circumstances than others. And I don't they our goal in the class is to make sure that they understand that these fancy ideas of design can just be simplified into everyday actions and decisions that they take just as regular as common sense. And so I love the fact that you narrowed that down, because you nail it to what our Professor Galvez and I've been saying is, you guys design every single day. Because designing is about making decisions. And so this is something that we're constantly doing. There's some people just to get the title, but we are all doing it every single day. So thank you so much, Feryal, for nailing that on the head. I didn't say it, kids. It was her. She is the one who's making sure you guys get it. You guys, we're all designers and we're all utilizing all these tools every single day. But it's also it's very nice and it's very good to know what these tools are called, right? So thank you so much, Feryal. I mean, it's a pleasure seeing you every single day. I could talk to you every day, all day. This is the woman that taught me the beginning of everything in design. So I'm delighted that you guys had a sense of what it is to be a student of Feryal. You get so much information and not just you get it, you actually understand it. So thank you, Feryal, for your time and your candor and your fantastic visuals. This was fantastic. I love it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was my pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And so students,
thank you so much.
We'll see you guys in our class back, and Feryal again, hugs and say hi to the mom.
I will do that.
Thank you.
Thank you so
guys.
much.
Thank you all for coming, guys.